I'm running out of new places to give lectures. So we're talking about consciousness on my back deck in the dark. So in chapter 2 from Solomon's little philosophy book entitled Consciousness, he talks about 4 different things. Number 1, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be conscious? Number 2, how can we know that others are conscious? Number 3, what does it mean to be rational and autonomous? And number 4, just a few thoughts about identity in the self. So number 1, what does it mean to be conscious or have consciousness? And again, but to clarify, this isn't a conscience. We're not talking about Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder telling you that you shouldn't do that. We're talking about awareness, the field of vision, the fact that you are able to experience the world and be aware of the world. And Solomon tells us there are at least 2 ways that we can use that term. And the first way to be conscious is to be aware of one's surroundings, to be able to observe and see things. And right now I can see different moths and bugs and such out here flying around my back deck light, and I can of course hear the frogs chirping in the distance and the crickets and the cicadas, I believe, making the various noises. The second way in which we can be conscious is to be aware of ourselves. I'm not only aware of my external surroundings, but I'm also aware of the fact that, hey, I'm in a body and I'm some dude. I'm not just experiencing stuff, I'm aware of myself as well. And Solomon doesn't say this, but I think there's actually a third way that we can talk about consciousness. In fact, maybe a higher level of consciousness, and that is being aware of our awareness. So not only is it the fact that I'm aware of things, not only is it the fact that I'm aware of myself, but I'm aware of the fact that I'm aware. And so that's perhaps a third way in which we could be conscious. And if you want to think about a way to distinguish conscious things from unconscious things, just think about a rock. A rock doesn't have consciousness as far as we can tell. It doesn't ever have thoughts. It doesn't have a mind. It doesn't experience the world. Then we might think about perhaps a sponge. Maybe a sponge in the ocean that perhaps reacts to light in some way. Maybe it has some level of consciousness. We're not sure. It doesn't have a nervous system, and so we're pretty doubtful about that, because it seems to be the case that all creatures that actually have thoughts have a nervous system and some sort of a network of neurons in a brain, or a ganglia, or whatever it's called that insects have. Sponges don't have that, but they do respond to things. So let's not say a sponge is conscious. But how about a shrimp? A shrimp has a very, very basic nervous system. Maybe it's conscious. Go a little bit higher up and say perhaps a grasshopper. A grasshopper has eyes, it runs around. Maybe it has thoughts, it certainly experiences things. What about a puppy? A puppy certainly seems to be conscious. I mean, a puppy can see, it can hear, it can feel, it can make very basic decisions. When a dog is older, depending on the breed, perhaps it can make very complex decisions. Go a little bit higher up the food chain, maybe we talk about a human baby. A human baby is most definitely conscious. It definitely has a field of vision, it definitely has thoughts, it definitely experiences the world. Think about an adolescent child, or perhaps not even an adolescent child, but a child of, say, 6 months or a year. Whenever the kid first starts looking into the mirror and they realize, hey, I'm a real person. I'm an actual entity. All these different things I've been receiving from the world around me, they're being fed into a person, into one entity. And so then they become conscious of themselves. And then later, when that child takes a philosophy class, they begin to reflect on the fact that they have consciousness, and in fact they observe their surroundings and themselves. Then they get that highest level, that awareness of awareness. So those are 3 different levels of consciousness. The second question in this chapter, and the second thing that Solomon covers, is how can we know that others are conscious? And this is actually a question that maybe you've never considered, but how is it you know that everyone around you isn't simply a robot? In fact, how do you know for sure that we're all just not figments of your imagination? I think that'll come in a later chapter. But for now, how can you know that we're conscious? And Solomon gives 2 answers. First, he cites John Paul Sartre, who apparently argued that you can look a person in the eye and just know that they're conscious from the way they look at you. I've never read that directly in Sartre, but that's something for us to consider. What do you think? Can you just look at another person in the eye and know that they're conscious? Could they trick you? Could perhaps we have robots that are so sophisticated that we wouldn't know? What if it's maybe Data from Star Trek? And actually, it's a good question whether or not Data is conscious, but we'll talk about that perhaps another time. The second way we can know that other people are conscious, argues Solomon, is the fact that language exists to describe consciousness. We, of course, didn't create language. We were just born into the world, and we learned a language. And language, of course, just refers to sounds that refer to concepts, and concepts that describe the world. And the fact that there's a language there to describe consciousness means that others must have already been conscious to have described it and have that language to do so, because we certainly didn't come up with these different words, consciousness and thought and awareness, etc. So those are, I think, some pretty good reasons that we can know that other people are conscious. Maybe not looking at them in the eye, but I think language, I think there's a good case to be made there. Next thing that Solomon talks about, the third thing, is rationality. And to be rational means to be able to weigh reasons, to weigh evidence, and to make decisions in accordance with perhaps our own plans, our own interests, our own desires, in light of those different reasons. And this enables something called autonomy. And to be autonomous means to be able to make your own life plan and actually execute it, to make decisions that you yourself are the author of. And so Solomon says, quote, "I recognize my strong desire for another piece of pie, but I reflect that because I'm trying to lose weight, I should ignore or fight that desire." Whereas the Buddha would say you should just let go of that desire, Solomon. But in any case, rationality allows us to make these higher level decisions. I've had a very, very smart German Shepherd for about 11 years. And I did have a very smart German Shepherd for 11 years. He recently died. And that dog was a very smart dog, and he could make decisions such as, should or shouldn't I chase this Frisbee past the property line? And he would stop and decide not to because he knew that it would displease me. But never did Murdoch make a decision about his own character. Never did Murdoch decide, I need to lose some weight, therefore I'm going to eat less food. Murdoch ate whatever you put in front of him. Murdoch also didn't stop and think, do I want to be more of a family dog or more of a security dog? He was an excellent dog, but his personality wasn't really to his credit. It was a function of his breed, his genetics, and his raising. He was a product of his environment. Murdoch didn't make decisions about the sort of dog he became, but although he was a very smart dog and a wonderful dog, and I miss him very much, he didn't possess rationality, and therefore he didn't possess autonomy. However, you and I possess both of those things, and we can make hard decisions about the sort of persons we would like to become, and then actually act on those decisions. We're of course influenced by our genes, we're of course influenced by our environment, but we can break out of both of those things because we possess rationality. We can weigh reasons, we can make serious decisions, we can become whomever we'd like to become. And last, Solomon says a few things about the self. And of course, we discussed the self and our personal identity at length when we read the dialogue on personal identity and immortality. And Solomon argues that most of us anyway, identify with the fact that we are rational. That's very important to us, to our sense of self. So too are our memories. So too are our passions, the things that we love and the things that we hate. And the fact, he says something there toward the end that I thought was pretty interesting. He said the fact that we are mortal makes our lives that much more precious and every moment that much more interesting. So that's something interesting to reflect on that's kind of out of left field. Is it the fact that at least we're going to die physically at some point? Does that fact make our lives much more valuable and each moment much more precious? And if, for example, we knew with beyond a shadow of a doubt that we were immortal, that there was no reason at all to worry that perhaps our consciousness might end at some point, would that make life much less precious? Would we take it for granted? Would we be less ambitious, less loving, less caring? Would we care less about the development of ourselves and our world, etc., etc.? So the question for this particular chapter is to just reflect on those four different things. We talk about what consciousness is, what it means to be conscious, how we can know others are conscious, what it means to be rational, autonomous, and also a few closing remarks about identity and the value of life in light of the fact that we're physically mortal. I want you to think about those four different areas, and I want you to give a response to whichever of those you found most interesting. Think about it a bit and impress me. Thanks so much for your attention.